Let's talk about the mouth. Okay. Anatomically, oral cavity and buccal cavity. So oral cavity, it's actually, we often call this whole thing oral cavity. It's not entirely correct. Oral cavity is behind your teeth. Does that make sense? Buccal cavity is between the teeth and the cheeks and lips. Okay, so teeth are basically a barrier. We're not going to go over the taste receptors. We did that in a pretty decent details in AP1. I already mentioned that it is stratified squamous epithelium. We're going to discuss basically what you need to know about the anatomy of a tooth and which teeth you need to know, stuff like that, and the salivation reflex. Okay, so when we talk about teeth, you have deciduous and permanent. Remember, there are 4 types. You have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. So incisors, cutting off the pieces, canines, shearing the things like meat, and premolars and molars to grind the food. Actually, it reflects very well the fact that humans are omnivores, because we can kind of successfully eat all kinds of food. What do you need to know about deciduous teeth? There are no premolars. Okay, I'm not particularly hung up on, yeah, there are 20 deciduous, 32 permanent. I'm not too hung up on the numbers, as you know. I do want you to know that there are no premolars in deciduous teeth. And also, you should be able to recognize the type of a tooth on the picture. So all the same, so basically I can show you the picture of a jaw. You don't have to say if it's upper or lower, I don't care about this one, but I pointed the incisor and you should identify it as an incisor, right? So if it's a tooth, I know it's not far from perfect picture. So on the outside, it's enamel, the hardest material in the human body. Actually, kind of a small digression. You may have encountered studies of like diseases that humans had, 700, 800 years ago, thanks to enamel, because it conserves the DNA within the tooth really, really well. Okay. Then under the enamel you have dentin. That's bone, basically. And within the dentin you have a pulp cavity. And within the pulp cavity you have blood vessels and nerves. So when you have root canal surgery, basically pulpitis. Okay, so what happens? Bacteria chew through the enamel, dissolve the dentin, and then when your pulp cavity got inflamed, nerve feels that pain, and you have to get it cleaned. The main problem is after the root canal work, once the tooth loses the blood supply and nerve stimulation, it's basically dead, and they don't last long. So you have to get it under the crown, best case scenario. I'm painfully aware of that. Kind of a parts here. So this is the crown of the tooth, neck, root. When, for instance, you see people in the brawl, they lose the teeth and they say, oh, they knocked teeth out. generally, in most cases, so I'm not a dentist, but I was brought up among a whole bunch of dentists. We had a lot of friends, and they said that knocking the tooth out completely with the root is really, really hard. You have to punch so hard that you can break the jaw, basically. So most of them, they're basically broken. So if God forbid it happens to anyone you know, if they can find the upper part, it can be actually installed back on a little thingy, yeah. Okay, make sense? Now, well, mastication, nothing fancy there, just chewing on the stuff. More interesting process is the salivation. So, salivation is your typical autonomic parasympathetic reflex. By parasympathetic, I mean that it is stimulated by the parasympathetic neurotransmitters, so to say, So this is how it works. Check this out. So you've got food in your mouth. It can be smell, actually. It can be taste. It can be sight. Anything. Even thought. Okay? So that signal goes to the medulla. Now, obviously, if you are thinking about the food, then the signal goes from your cortex to the medulla, but it all comes to the medulla. And medulla stimulates salivary glands. Okay? So, salivary glands can be intrinsic. They are located everywhere in the mouth, basically, like cheeks, lips, and they can be extrinsic. So I have three of them. Largest parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. So these are big multicellular, okay, glands that generate most of the saliva. Actually, parotid is the largest, but it generates only about a quarter. My problem is dichotomous choice. I can never remember if it's submandibular or sublingual that produces more. Doesn't matter. I'm not going to ask this. So what are the components of saliva that help us to digest food? So water, obviously, needed to dissolve the food particles. Mucus. Saliva is the mixed mucoserous mucus and serous secretion. Mucus, the protein mucin, works as a glue for the food particles, so it makes it sticky. Okay. Salt, obviously, sodium chloride, stuff like that. Lysozyme, which is antibacterial, and immunoglobulin A, which is also antibacterial. Okay. Does that make sense? So, what about the chemical digestion? Because chemical digestion starts actually in the mouth. So there are two enzymes that are produced by saliva. Not by saliva, sorry, by salivary glands. So now, I want to be very clear about that. I'm not going to ask which glands produce which. But lingual lipase is produced by intrinsic. I'm not going to ask this. So lingual lipase, which is responsible for the breakdown of fats, right? And you have salivary amylase, which is responsible for the breakdown of starch. Does that make sense? So just few, I don't know how to say, observations, so to say. So first of all, we already figured that this is an autonomic reflex. So we basically talk about sympathetic versus parasympathetic stimulation. So, you know, when you eat something and you have saliva being produced, that's obviously parasympathetic stimulation. Now, what happens when you are stressed? Your mouth becomes dry. Now, obviously, when you're stressed, sympathetic system is activated, your mouth becomes dry. But there's actually a really cool mechanism why it becomes dry. Blood vessels that supply blood to salivary glands under sympathetic stimulation constrict. Less blood means less fluid delivery. Less fluid delivery simply means less saliva produced. It's one of the things that, you know, we often underappreciate or just never think about it. I often ask this question: what is the ultimate source of all fluids produced in the body? What's the ultimate? So where do all the fluids that are produced in the body, saliva, urine, gastric secretions, pancreatic juice, CSF, where do they get fluid? Where do they get water from? Well, yeah, but like what carries water around the human body? The answer is so simple, it's so on the surface that you just don't see it.
Blood?
Yeah, blood. It's blood. So if you increase blood supply to wherever, it simply brings more water. If you increase blood supply to kidneys, you're going to make more urine. You increase blood supply to salivary glands, you're going to make more saliva. You decrease it, you're going to make less saliva. Does that make sense? Another sort of important implication clinically, you have a patient with salivary glands removed, and salivary glands aren't removed per se. There's a separate, for me it was kind of a discovery that in oncology, it's sort of a separate branch of surgical oncology called head and neck tumors of different origin, but head and neck. So when they are in the head and the neck, often when they're removed, salivary glands are removed. And if the person loses a substantial portion of salivary glands, then the salivary production is going to decrease. And a couple of big problems that these patients face: caries, much less antibacterial proteins, and inability to form a proper bolus of food in the mouth. The amount of mucin that they produce, so little, they can't make it in a, swallowable, so to say, bolus. I don't know what to compare it with, but probably it's like try to swallow sand that can't be glued together. One interesting feature, I always tell students this, how you can detect salivary amylase, the one that breaks down starch in your saliva. Take a bread, preferably like rye bread, the one that is not sweet by itself, just plain bread. Start chewing that for a really, really long time. Just keep it in the mouth, don't swallow it. And salivary amylase will break down starch to glucose, and you will start feeling sweetness. Make sense? Disease, the only disease that I can think of is perioditis. I would call it mumps, viral infection. I always try to bring up viruses wherever I can. So it's virus infection, totally vaccine preventable.